They laughed when a quiet veteran returned to a forgotten ridge, inheriting nothing but an old mill and land everyone else wanted to sell. They said it wasn't worth saving. They said he should walk away before the world crushed him again. But they didn't see what the land remembered. They didn't hear what the silence was protecting. And they didn't notice the one who never left his side, a loyal K9 who sensed danger long before it showed its face. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Red Maple, Vermont, endured winter without ceremony. Snow lay in compressed layers along the roads, gray at the edges where tires had passed too often, white only where no one bothered to clear it. The sky pressed low and flat, draining color from the town and shortening the day until afternoon felt like evening. Wind moved through bare maple branches with a dry, rasping sound that carried between buildings, sharp enough to sting exposed skin and persistent enough to make people walk faster. This was not the kind of winter that inspired postcards. It was the kind that tested routines and rewarded those who kept moving. A worn pickup rolled in from the east, engine humming unevenly, exhaust drifting in a thin plume. The truck slowed near the general store, paused at the stop sign, then continued through town without turning. The driver did not crane his neck or slow to look. He watched the road the way someone does when he already knows what he'll find. Caleb Monroe was 40 years old and looked every year of it, though not in the way people expected. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, built with the dense strength of someone trained to carry weight for long distances, but the rest of him was spare. Lean in the face, tight around the mouth. His jaw was squared, cheekbones defined beneath skin roughened by wind, and a short, dark stubble traced his chin and upper lip. His hair was cut close, a practical style that had outlasted its original purpose, and gray had begun to show at the temples. His eyes were a muted gray blue, alert without searching, steady in the way of someone accustomed to reading rooms quickly and moving on. When he wore a heavy canvas jacket in a dull olive tone, frayed at the cuffs, zipped high against the cold. His boots were scuffed and well-maintained, the kind repaired rather than replaced. Nothing about him stood out, yet nothing about him suggested comfort. He carried himself with a quiet reserve, as if attention were something to be managed rather than invited. In the passenger seat, a dog watched the town with equal focus. Shadow was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, lean and compact, with a short sable coat darkening along his back and lightening to tan around his legs and muzzle. His ears stood upright, turning slightly as the truck passed the diner, the post office, the small brick church. His eyes were dark and attentive, calm but precise. There was a faint scar along one ear, barely visible unless you knew to look. Shadow's posture was disciplined, alert without tension, ready without restlessness. He was a working dog by instinct and training, deeply attuned to Caleb's movements, breathing, and mood. Caleb had not come back to Red Maple out of sentiment. He had left 15 years earlier and stayed away with intention. He enlisted after his mother's death, driven less by patriotism than by the need to escape a house that had become a catalog of things that could not be fixed. When he returned from service, he did not come home. He built a life elsewhere, functional, contained, temporary. Shadow entered that life later, adopted through a K9 transition program after Caleb's second discharge. The dog did not save him in any dramatic sense. He anchored him. Routine, responsibility, and the steady presence of another living thing made the days manageable. The letter that brought Caleb back was brief and official. It arrived in a plain envelope bearing the return address of a local attorney's office. The subject line was direct: estate notice. The name beneath it stopped him cold. Henry Monroe, his grandfather. The last person in Red Maple who had never asked Caleb to explain himself. Henry had been a woodworker by trade, not as a pastime, but as a discipline. He was tall and wiry, bent slightly from decades at a bench, with hands that understood grain and pressure the way musicians understood timing. His beard had turned white early, his voice remained measured, and his silences were intentional. When Caleb was a boy, Henry's workshop had been a refuge. The smell of cut wood and oil, the steady sound of tools. The unhurried pace, none of it demanded answers. After Caleb's mother died, Henry did not offer platitudes. He let Caleb sweep floors, stack scrap, and sit in the quiet where making things still made sense. Caleb parked beside the town hall, where snow had been plowed into hard, uneven ridges. Shadow jumped down first, paws crunching softly. He made a small circle, nose low, then returned to Caleb's side. Caleb shut the door and stood for a moment, letting the cold settle. The town noticed him. Heads turned, then turned away. Recognition in red maple did not mean welcome. It meant adjustment. Inside the building, the air was warm and smelled faintly of wet coats and paper. A woman behind the counter looked up, then looked again. She was in her early 30s, average height, wearing a thick gray sweater. Her hair, chestnut brown, was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her cheeks were flushed from the heat. Her name tag read, Mara. Her eyes were sharp, observant, with a practiced politeness that could harden if needed. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Caleb Monroe," he said. "I'm here for the estate meeting. Henry Monroe." Recognition flickered across her face. "The grandson." Her gaze dropped briefly to Shadow. "Conference room's down the hall. They'll start shortly." "Thanks," Caleb said. "You can bring him," she added, nodding toward the dog. "As long as he behaves." Shadow sat without command. Mara's mouth tightened into a faint smile. "Looks like he already does." The conference room was half full. A cluster of older men sat along one side, coats open, postures relaxed. Two women sat near the window. One of them, in her late 50s, wore her blonde hair in a precise style and lipstick applied with care. Her posture was rigid, composed. Her eyes moved over Caleb's jacket, boots, and the dog, then away. Dismissal came easily to her. Caleb chose a chair near the back. Shadow sat beside him, still and watchful. The dog's presence altered the room in subtle ways. People adjusted their seats, lowered their voices. The attorney entered carrying a folder. Grant Halden was in his early 60s, thin with wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. His movements were careful, his tone measured. He arranged papers, then began. He read through the formalities, minor assets, household items, tools, a modest savings account. Each item was met with nods, murmurs of approval. Then, Halden paused, finger resting on the page. When he cleared his throat and looked up. "And to Caleb Monroe," he said. "Henry Monroe leaves the property at the North Ridge, the old mill workshop, the storage shed, and the surrounding land, along with everything contained within." The room held its breath for a moment. Then a soft laugh broke near the window. Another followed. The blonde woman smiled openly. Someone muttered that the place was a wreck. Another suggested scrap value. Caleb did not respond. He kept his gaze steady, hands folded. He had learned which battles fed on reaction. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against Caleb's knee. The contact grounded him. Caleb exhaled slowly. The meeting ended with signatures and polite farewells. Halden handed Caleb a set of keys in a thin envelope. "This is for you," Halden said quietly. Henry asked that you receive it alone." Caleb nodded and slipped the envelope into his jacket without opening it. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, fine and persistent. Shadow jumped into the truck. Caleb took the driver's seat and rested his hands on the wheel. The keys lay heavy in his palm. He started the engine and pulled onto the road leading north, away from town and toward the forest. He was not driving toward a gift. He was driving toward whatever Henry believed he could carry. For the first time in years, Caleb did not feel the urge to turn back. The road narrowed as soon as Caleb left the last streetlight behind. Pavement gave way to packed dirt glazed with ice, rutted where trucks had passed and frozen in place. Pines crowded closer, their trunks dark and vertical, the forest absorbing sound until the truck's engine felt too loud, too exposed. Snow fell steadily now, not heavy enough to blind him, but persistent, the kind that erased edges and softened distance. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, posture unchanged. Shadow stood braced on the passenger seat, weight distributed evenly, ears pivoting toward the faintest shifts beyond the glass. North Ridge rose gradually, a long shoulder of land that caught weather before the town ever felt it. Caleb remembered this road as narrower than it was, steeper, but memory tended to exaggerate hardship. What hadn't changed was the sense of leaving one place and entering another. The forest pressed in until the truck headlights carved a narrow tunnel through branches and falling snow. When the mill appeared, it did so without warning. Set back from the road in a shallow clearing, roofline sagging slightly under the weight of years, walls darkened by weather and time. Caleb cut the engine and sat for a moment. Silence settled quickly, thick and immediate. Snow hissed softly as it landed on metal and wood. Shadow jumped down first, paws crunching, posture shifting the moment he hit the ground. His head lifted, nose testing the air. He did not bark. He did not advance. He simply stood alert, as if acknowledging a place that had not decided what it was yet. The mill was larger than Caleb remembered. Not imposing, but solid. Built to last rather than impress. The main structure leaned slightly, the porch boards warped and gray, but the bones were sound. A smaller shed sat farther back, half hidden by trees. Caleb took the keys from his pocket and crossed the clearing. The door protested when he turned the lock, metal scraping against old wood, but it opened. Inside, the air was cold and dry, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of old lumber and machine oil. Dust lay undisturbed on the floorboards, but not thick enough to suggest abandonment. Tools hung where they belonged, benches were clear. Machines were covered with canvas sheets, edges tucked in with care. This was not neglect. It was preservation. Caleb moved slowly, boots careful, as if sudden motion might disturb something that had been intentionally left at rest. Shadow followed, bound stopping just inside the doorway, body angled toward the opening rather than the room. He sat, back straight, eyes tracking the forest beyond the door, guarding, not intruding. Caleb crossed to the nearest bench and ran his hand along the surface, smooth, recently oiled. He lifted a corner of the canvas covering the lathe. The metal beneath was clean, the bearings greased. Someone had been here not long ago, or someone had planned for a long absence and expected a return. A sound carried from outside, a single crunch of boots on snow. Shadow rose at once, body rigid, a low sound building in his chest. Caleb held up a hand, palm down. "Easy," he said quietly. A man stepped into view at the edge of the clearing, hands visible, posture open. He was in his early 50s, tall but slightly stooped, and with a frame that suggested years of physical labor. His beard was thick and gray, trimmed short but uneven, and his face bore deep lines around the eyes and mouth. He wore a heavy flannel shirt beneath a faded brown jacket, work gloves tucked into his back pocket. His hair, once dark, had gone fully silver and lay flat against his head, as if he no longer bothered to argue with it. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man said, voice steady, unhurried. "Name's Elias Boone." Caleb stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him without locking it. "Caleb Monroe." Elias nodded, eyes flicking briefly to Shadow, then back to Caleb's face. "Figured you might come up tonight. Henry used to say you didn't waste daylight." "How do you know Henry?" Caleb asked. "Worked the mill with him off and on. Last 10 years mostly watched the place. He kept the roof patched, ran the machines now and then so they wouldn't seize." Elias shifted his weight, boots scraping. "Didn't know if anyone would ever come for it, but he asked me to keep it ready." "For me," Caleb said. Elias's mouth tightened into something like a smile. "He didn't say who. Just said the right person would recognize the work." Shadow stepped forward once, then stopped. Elias glanced down, measured the dog, and nodded as if satisfied. "Good animal." "He is," Caleb said. They stood in the cold, the mill behind them, dark and patient. Elias gestured toward the shed. "There's a small stove inside the main building. Still works. If you're staying the night, you'll want it going before the temperature drops again." "I am staying," Caleb said. Elias nodded. "I'll leave you to it. I live a mile down the ridge. If you need anything." He hesitated, then added, "Henry trusted this place to someone who could listen. That hasn't changed." He turned and walked back into the trees, his figure quickly swallowed by falling snow. Inside, Caleb lit the stove and fed it carefully, coaxing the flame rather than forcing it. Warmth spread slowly, inch by inch. He unpacked only what he needed: a blanket, a small kettle, coffee grounds. The routines were familiar, grounding. Shadow circled once, then lay near the door, broad back facing the room, muzzle resting on his paws. Sleep came unevenly. Caleb dozed in short stretches, waking at small sounds, the shift of wood, the wind pushing against the walls. Once he woke with his heart racing, images flickering at the edge of thought. Shadow rose immediately and pressed his weight against Caleb's leg. Oh, solid and warm. Caleb focused on the dog's breathing until the room settled again. Morning arrived, pale and quiet. Snow had stopped. Light filtered through the windows, turning dust motes silver. Caleb brewed coffee and stepped outside. The clearing lay untouched, the forest hushed as if listening. Shadow stood beside him, tail low, gaze steady. Caleb looked at the mill, at the careful order inside, at the stove warming the space back to life. He understood now that this place had not been left behind. It had been held. He closed the door gently and slid the keys into his pocket, not as a possession, but as a promise. The ridge did not ask him to hurry. It asked him to stay long enough to learn its shape. Morning settled over North Ridge without drama. The cold eased just enough to let breath rise in softer plumes, and the snow on the trees released itself in small cascades when the wind shifted. Caleb moved through the mill with deliberate care, not cleaning yet, not repairing, simply learning the space as it was. He had learned overseas that places revealed themselves only when you gave them time. Shadow tracked him step for step, 7 years old and precise, nails clicking lightly on the boards, ears turning toward the forest whenever a sound carried too close. The dog's discipline had mellowed with age, but not dulled. He watched the mill as if it were a perimeter. Caleb began with inventory. Not on paper, he wasn't ready for that, but with his hands and eyes. He lifted canvas, checked belts, tested switches without power. He felt for looseness in joints. The machines answered honestly. They had been run just often enough to stay awake. Elias had kept his word. That knowledge sat well with Caleb. It meant the past here had not been abandoned, it had been tended. Near the back wall, beneath a narrow window, Caleb noticed a cabinet he hadn't opened the night before. The wood was darker than the benches, the grain tighter, the hinges oiled. He unlocked it with a small key that hung on a nail nearby. Inside were ledgers, several of them, each labeled by year in Henry's careful hand. Dates, notes, names, not accounts in the financial sense, but records of work done, materials traded, favors exchanged. Henry had written about people the way he wrote about wood, what they could bear, where they splintered, what held them together. Caleb carried the top ledger to the bench and opened it. The entries were measured, spare. He recognized names from town, some still living, some not. He recognized the tone, too. Henry did not romanticize. He recorded. That steadiness was a relief. A knock sounded at the open door, not loud, considerate. Shadow stood at once, body aligned with the threshold. Caleb closed the ledger and set it aside. A woman waited on the porch, hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy navy coat. She was in her late 30s, average height, with a build that suggested strength earned rather than advertised. Her hair, dark blonde, was cut short at the nape and tucked behind one ear, practical and wind-tossed. Her face held the marks of someone used to weather, light lines around the eyes, a faint redness at the cheeks, and her expression was calm but watchful. She wore sturdy boots, clean but worn, and a knit cap pulled low. "I'm Sarah Ives," she said, voice even. "Elias mentioned you'd arrived." Caleb nodded. "Caleb." Her gaze flicked to Shadow, assessing without fear. "That's a good dog." "He is." Sarah stepped forward a pace, stopping when Shadow held his ground. She waited, letting the moment settle, then looked back to Caleb. "I managed the feed store in town. Used to bring Henry supplies when the roads were bad. He said if you came, you might need help sorting what was here and what wasn't." Caleb considered her. Her posture was open, but she didn't lean in. That restraint mattered. "I'm still figuring that out." She nodded, accepting the boundary. "I brought coffee." She lifted a thermos from her pocket. And bread. Fresh." Caleb took them, surprised at the quiet relief the simple gesture brought. "Thank you." They stood inside, warmth from the stove cutting the edge of the cold. Sarah glanced around the mill, eyes moving with familiarity. "He kept it like this," she said. "Always said machines deserved respect, same as people." Shadow settled at Caleb's feet. Sarah noticed the dog's position, the way his body angled. "He's trained," she said. not a question. Yes. My brother was, she added. Army. He came back different. She stopped there, not offering more than necessary. Henry helped him once, gave him work when he wouldn't take charity. That explained the tone in Henry's ledgers, the way he wrote about patience as a tool. Sarah set the bread on the bench and glanced toward the back of the mill. There's a storage room you probably haven't seen yet, not the shed, the small one beneath the floor. Caleb's attention sharpened. Beneath the floor, she nodded. Henry called it the cold room, said it kept things dry and quiet. Elias never went down there. Henry didn't ask him to. Caleb felt the ledger's weight again, the keys in his pocket. Where? Sarah crossed to a section of floor near the cabinet, tapped once with her boot. The sound was different. Here. Caleb knelt and found the seam, narrow and precise. He lifted the panel. A stair descended into dimness, the air cooler, drier. Shadow leaned forward, sniffed, then sat back, eyes fixed. Guarding the threshold. Caleb descended slowly, hand on the wall, counting steps by habit. The space below was deliberate. Stone walls fitted tight, shelving built to carry weight. The boxes labeled in Henry's hand. Not many. Just enough. A work table stood at the center with a single lamp and a stack of envelopes tied with twine. Caleb didn't touch them yet. He scanned first the way he had been trained. No surprises, no traps, just order. He returned upstairs and replaced the panel. Sarah watched him carefully. He didn't want everything found at once, she said. Said some things made sense only after you'd lived with a place. Caleb nodded. That sounded like Henry. They spent the rest of the morning walking the perimeter. Sarah pointed out where runoff cut the path in spring, where the roof would need attention before the next heavy snow. She spoke plainly, without urgency. Her competence was quiet. Caleb appreciated that. Near the tree line, a horse stood tethered, chestnut with a white blaze down its face. It lifted its head when they approached, ears forward. Sarah smiled and reached out, palm open. That's Rowan, 12 years old, stubborn but honest. Henry used him to haul lumber when the ground was too soft for trucks. Rowan snorted softly, accepting Sarah's touch, then turned one dark eye toward Caleb. The horse's coat was thick, well kept, the tack clean. Another sign. Nothing here had been left to chance. In the afternoon, Elias returned with a crate of kindling and a spare lantern. He and Sarah spoke easily, familiarity born of shared work rather than affection. Elias's presence grounded the place. He showed Caleb where the roof had been patched, where the foundation held firm. He did not offer advice, unless asked. As daylight thinned, Caleb sat alone at the bench and opened one envelope from the cold room. Inside was a letter, and short and precise. Henry wrote about stewardship, about choosing the right hands over the loudest ones, about work that lasted because it was meant to. Caleb folded the letter and set it beside the ledger. Shadow rested his head on Caleb's boot, breathing steady. Outside, the ridge held its quiet. Caleb did not decide anything that night. He simply accepted that the measure of what had been left to him was not property, but expectation, and that expectation was already shaping his days. The weather shifted overnight. Not dramatically, but enough for Caleb to feel it before he saw it. The air carried more weight, the cold pressing closer to the skin, the sky sealed in a dull slate that promised snow by afternoon. North Ridge responded to weather the way old structures did, quietly, without complaint, but with consequences if ignored. Caleb woke early, the habits of years still intact, and moved through the mill with measured steps, taking note of small changes. A new draft near the door, frost feathering the lower window panes, the stove needing more fuel to hold its heat. Shadow rose with him, 7 years old and steady, joints stiff for a moment before settling into rhythm. His coat caught the low light, sable dark along the spine, lighter at the chest where his breathing showed. He drank, ate without urgency, and then returned to his post near the door, ears adjusting as the forest stirred. Age had softened his edges, but it had sharpened his judgment. He did not react unless there was reason. Caleb spent the morning in the cold room. Not to uncover everything, he resisted that instinct, but to understand the system Henry had built. Boxes were arranged by purpose, not value. Tools that could not be replaced, documents wrapped against moisture, A few personal items that had no obvious use, a cracked compass, a faded photograph, a small brass whistle worn smooth by handling. Each item was labeled in Henry's hand with short notes that explained enough and no more. Caleb recognized the restraint. Henry had trusted that the right person would know when to stop digging. One box, smaller than the rest, held maps, not official surveys, but hand-drawn overlays marked with symbols and dates, paths through the ridge, areas noted for seasonal runoff, a circle drawn around a stand of older pines east of the mill. Caleb traced the lines with his finger, committing them to memory. This wasn't nostalgia. It was preparation. A truck climbed the ridge road near midday, its engine laboring. Shadow stood at once, posture alert but controlled. Caleb closed the lid on the map box and replaced it carefully before heading upstairs. The driver was a man in his early 40s, tall and angular, with a long face and a beard grown out of neglect rather than style. His hair was dark, thinning at the crown, and he wore a black wool coat over clothes that looked city new. His boots were expensive and impractical, already dusted with snow. He smiled easily, too easily, as if confidence were something he carried in his pocket. "Caleb Monroe," the man said, stepping out and extending a gloved hand. "Jonah Price." Caleb did not take the hand immediately. "What do you want?" Jonah laughed, unfazed. "Straight to it. I like that." He glanced past Caleb toward the mill, eyes measuring. "I represent a development group. We've been tracking land opportunities along the ridge, prime location, privacy, potential." Shadow stepped forward, positioning himself between Caleb and the visitor. Jonah noticed, adjusted his stance slightly, smile thinning. "I'm not selling," Caleb said. Jonah raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Just a conversation. No harm in that." "There is," Caleb replied, "when it wastes time." Jonah studied him for a moment, the friendliness receding into calculation. Think about it," he said. "Places like this don't stay quiet forever." Caleb held his gaze. "They do if you leave them alone." Jonah hesitated, then stepped back toward his truck. "I'll be in town a few days." "I won't," Caleb said. The truck reversed down the ridge, tires slipping once before finding purchase. Shadow watched until it disappeared, then returned to his place. The encounter left a residue Caleb didn't like, not fear, but recognition. Pressure would come. Henry had known that. By afternoon, snow began to fall in earnest. Thick flakes, heavy with moisture, reducing the world to near distance. Caleb decided to follow one of the hand-drawn paths before the light went. He saddled Rowan, the chestnut horse standing patient as always, 12 years old and built for endurance rather than speed. Where Rowan's coat steamed faintly in the cold, his white blaze stark against the gray day. He accepted the tack without fuss, ears flicking once at Shadow, whom he tolerated with mutual respect. The path wound east, narrower than expected, cut deep by years of passage. Rowan moved carefully, hooves finding ground beneath the snow. Shadow trotted ahead, nose low, occasionally stopping to confirm direction. The forest here felt older, denser. The trees stood closer together, their roots gripping the slope with quiet authority. They reached the stand of pines marked on Henry's map, just as the snow thickened. The ground dipped, sheltered from wind. Caleb dismounted and led Rowan forward, studying the terrain. He noticed the subtle signs Henry had taught him to see. Stones cleared by hand, branches trimmed cleanly rather than broken. The faint impression of a structure that had once stood and been deliberately removed. At the center of the clearing stood a low stone foundation, no walls remaining, just the outline. Beside it, half buried, was a metal hatch, rusted but intact. Shadow stopped abruptly, body tense, head lowered. He did not growl. He waited. Caleb brushed snow away from the hatch and tested the latch. It held. He did not force it. Not yet. The presence of the place mattered more than entry. Henry had not hidden this. He had anchored it. They returned to the mill as dusk fell, the snow easing into a fine curtain. Caleb unsaddled Rowan, rubbed him down, and left him with fresh water and hay. Inside, the mill glowed warmer than before, the stove steady. That evening, Elias arrived briefly, bringing word from town. Jonah Price had been asking questions. Not aggressively, but persistently. Elias's face was set, lines deepened by concern. Henry expected this, he said. Said there'd be men who heard empty and thought available. Caleb nodded. I won't rush. Good, Elias said. This place doesn't answer to pressure. After Elias left, Caleb sat alone at the bench and opened another envelope from the cold room. The letter spoke of patience as a form of defense, of land that remembered those who walked it with care, of the danger of mistaking silence for weakness. Caleb folded the letter and set it aside. Outside, snow covered the tracks of the day. Shadow lay at his feet, breathing slow and even. Rowan shifted in the shelter, the sound steady, reassuring. Caleb understood now that the ridge was not merely holding history, it was testing intent, and so far it was waiting. The snow lingered for 3 days, not deep enough to trap the mill, but persistent enough to slow everything. Caleb accepted the pace. He split wood in the mornings, worked through Henry's ledgers in the afternoons, and walked the perimeter at dusk with Shadow moving a half-step ahead, the dog's gait steady and economical. Rowan remained calm in the shelter, chestnut coat dulled by winter light, breath clouding as he shifted his weight. Nothing felt urgent. That, Caleb knew, was the test. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared to a hard blue. Cold sharpened into something clean. Caleb returned to the cold room with a purpose he had resisted until now. He chose the smallest bundle of envelopes, the twine stiff with age, and carried it upstairs. Shadow followed but stopped at the threshold, sitting as if he understood that some boundaries were not his to cross. The first letter was brief. Henry wrote about pressure, how it arrived early and left late, how it wore down edges if you let it. The second letter named the stand of pines east of the ridge and warned against opening anything there without first understanding why it existed. The third letter was different. It contained a single sentence written in a firmer hand. Some things are not hidden. They are waiting for the right order. Caleb folded the letters and put them away. The order mattered. By midday, Elias returned with supplies, lamp oil, nails, a coil of rope. He spoke less than usual, jaw set, eyes scanning the road as if expecting another truck to climb it. Town's restless, he said. People notice when someone doesn't move the way they expect. Caleb nodded. They always do. Elias hesitated, then added, There's a boy. Comes by the feed store after school. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Henry used to let him help stack lumber for a few dollars. What's his name? Caleb asked. Luke Harmon, Elias said. 16. Lost his father 2 winters back. Logging accident. Since then, Elias shrugged. He listens more than he talks. That evening, as daylight thinned, footsteps approached the mill. Shadow rose but did not advance. A boy stood at the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, shoulders drawn in against the cold. He was tall for his age, narrow through the shoulders, with a face not yet finished settling into itself. His hair was dark and overgrown, falling into his eyes, and his cheeks were hollowed by a growth spurt that hadn't caught up yet. He wore a faded parka, too thin for the weather, and boots with cracked leather. He looked at the ground more than at the building. Caleb stepped onto the porch. You lost? The boy shook his head. Mr. Boone said you might need help. Caleb studied him, then nodded toward a stack of split logs. If you don't mind work? I don't, Luke said. His voice was quiet, steady. They worked without talking much. Luke stacked carefully, paying attention to balance. He did not rush. Shadow lay nearby, eyes open, watching. When Luke finished, he waited rather than asking what came next. You can come back tomorrow, Caleb said. If you want. Luke nodded once, relief passing briefly across his face before he masked it. Thank you. That night, Caleb returned to the maps. He noticed something he'd missed before, a sequence. The stand of pines was not the first point marked. It was the last. The initial markings traced a route beginning near the mill, then looping outward, then returning. Order. The next morning, Caleb took Shadow and followed the first path. It led to a shallow ravine where runoff cut hard in spring. Henry had reinforced the bank with stone, hidden by brush. Caleb understood. Protection before discovery. The second point lay farther south, an old culvert, cleared and stabilized. Another safeguard. Each stop was a lesson in patience, in preparation that anticipated failure. By the time Caleb reached the stand of pines again, he knew he wasn't meant to force entry. He was meant to ensure the ground around it would hold. Luke arrived mid-afternoon, breathless from the climb. Caleb handed him gloves and set him to clearing deadfall near the tree line. The work was simple, repetitive. Luke's movements were careful, almost cautious, as if he expected correction. Caleb offered none. When Luke finished, he stood back, waiting. "You did fine," Caleb said. Luke nodded, eyes down. "My dad used to say rushing makes mistakes louder." "Your dad was right." Luke hesitated. "He worked for Henry sometimes, said he was fair." "He was," Caleb said. Snow returned in the evening, light and dry. Jonah Price did not come back up the ridge, but his presence lingered like a rumor. Caleb felt it in the way Elias paused before speaking, in the way Sarah's visits grew more purposeful. She brought seed catalogs, spoke about spring, about what the land could support if treated carefully. Her confidence was grounded, not hopeful. She had learned to plan without guarantees. On the 6th day, Caleb made the decision Henry had been guiding him toward. He returned to the stand of pines with Shadow and Rowan, carrying the rope Elias had brought. He cleared snow from the hatch, brushed rust from the latch, and tested it. It gave with effort, metal, protesting but yielding. The space below was narrow and dry, reinforced with timber. Inside lay crates, fewer than expected, each sealed and labeled, tools, not valuables. Old surveying instruments, replacement parts for machines no longer made. A weatherproof case containing documents, deeds, easements, agreements signed decades ago that ensured the ridge could not be developed without unanimous consent from parties no longer living. Henry had built a defense not with force, but with foresight. Caleb closed the hatch and resealed it. He did not remove anything. Not yet. When he returned to the mill, Luke was there, sweeping. Sarah arrived soon after, carrying a box of gloves. Elias followed at dusk. They stood together in the warming light, not speaking of what lay east, but aware that something had shifted. That night, Caleb wrote his first entry in a new ledger. He recorded the weather, the work done, the names of those who helped. He did not write about the hatch. He wrote about order. Shadow slept at his feet. Rowan shifted in the shelter. Outside, the ridge held its silence, not empty but intact. Caleb understood now that what Henry left him was not a secret to uncover, but a structure to maintain. And maintenance, he knew, was a daily choice. The ridge changed once the snow melted back into the ground. What had looked smooth and forgiving revealed its seams, ruts carved by runoff, stones shifted by frost, the subtle tilts that told you where water would go when it had nowhere else to be. Caleb noticed these things now without effort. He read the land the way he once read streets after curfew, not for what was obvious, but for what would matter later. Work settled into a pattern that did not announce itself as progress. Luke arrived after school most days, shoulders hunched against the cold, hands red and raw until he warmed them by the stove. He said little, listened closely, and followed instructions exactly as given. Caleb gave him tasks that taught patience rather than speed, sorting hardware by thread and size, rewrapping belts, clearing brush without scarring the soil. The boy absorbed the rhythm as if it answered a question he had been holding since his father died. When mistakes happened, Luke corrected them without defense. That steadiness mattered. Sarah came twice a week with supplies and information. She had begun carrying a small notebook, pages filled with figures and notes about feed deliveries, seed orders, and transport routes that would reopen once the ground firmed. Her confidence came from competence, not optimism. She stood with her weight evenly set, hands steady, eyes taking in what needed doing without flinching. Caleb learned that she had stayed in Red Maple after her brother's return, because leaving would have been easier than watching him learn to live again. That choice had shaped her. She planned carefully and trusted slowly. Elias checked the roof with Caleb one afternoon, now moving along the edge with the balance of a man who had trusted ladders longer than people. His beard had gone fully gray since winter set in, but his hands were sure. When a board shifted under his weight, he adjusted without panic. "Nothing here fails all at once," he said. "It tells you first." The telling came sooner than expected. A notice arrived from town, delivered by mail carrier and rumor both. The council planned a review of zoning along the ridge, prompted by interest in economic development. The language was neutral, careful. The timing was not. Sarah brought the envelope and set it on the bench without comment. Luke read the header upside down and asked no questions. Elias exhaled once through his nose and looked away. Caleb read the notice twice. It did not accuse, it invited. That was worse. The night before the meeting, a storm cut across the ridge with a sharp, impatient wind. Caleb woke to the sound of something striking the mill, once, then again. Shadow was on his feet before Caleb reached the door. Outside, the lantern revealed a fallen branch lodged against the gutter, water spilling where it shouldn't. Caleb climbed the ladder in the dark, hands numb, fingers sure. Halfway down, the rung beneath Elias's foot, Elias had insisted on helping, gave way. He dropped hard, catching himself before the ground, but wrenching his shoulder. They got him inside, pain contained but present. Elias waved off concern with a tight smile that fooled no one. "Old joints," he said. "They remember things too." Caleb splinted the shoulder and set Elias near the stove. Shadow lay close, a steady heat against Elias's boots. The incident did not feel accidental. It felt like the land reminding them of cost. Morning came gray and wet. The council meeting was held in the same room where Henry's will had been read. The chairs were arranged more carefully now. Jonah Price sat near the front, coat pressed, beard trimmed, posture relaxed in a way that suggested familiarity with rooms like this. He nodded at Sarah, smiled at Luke, measured Caleb without greeting. The council chair, a woman in her early 60s with cropped white hair and a voice trained to sound impartial, outlined the agenda. "We're here to discuss opportunities," she said, eyes moving methodically, "and concerns." Caleb spoke when it was time. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He explained the easements Henry had secured, the maintenance he was undertaking, the reasons the ridge could not bear the weight of development without damage that would reach town within a season. He used plain language. He named consequences. He did not threaten. Jonah responded with projections and promises. He spoke of jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure. His tone was smooth, practiced. He avoided specifics where the ground demanded them. Luke watched from the back, jaw set, eyes fixed. When the chair invited public comment, he stood before he could reconsider. His voice shook once, then steadied. He spoke about his father, about the mill giving work when pride made asking impossible, about the ridge holding when everything else slid. He did not plead. He testified. Sarah spoke last. She did not tell a story. She presented numbers, runoff patterns, load limits, the cost of repair when shortcuts failed. She closed her notebook and waited. The vote was deferred. No victory, no loss, just time. That night, someone drove the ridge road after dark. Shadow heard at first, a low growl rising without bark. Headlights swept the clearing, then cut. Caleb stepped outside with the lantern. The truck idled beyond the trees, unseen. A door opened and closed. Footsteps approached the tree line and stopped. Caleb did not move forward. He raised the lantern and held it steady. "This is private land," he said. "You're trespassing." Silence answered. Then the footsteps retreated. The engine revved and faded. In the morning, tire tracks cut across the edge of the clearing, shallow but deliberate. Caleb photographed them, measured the width, noted the pattern. He did not call the sheriff. Not yet. He repaired the ground where it had been torn and marked the boundary with stakes set deep. Elias rested for a day, then insisted on returning, arm bound, movements slower but precise. "They'll test you," he said, "because testing is cheaper than asking." Caleb returned to the cold room that evening and opened one final envelope. Henry wrote about lines, how water followed them, how people crossed them, how the hardest ones were the ones that didn't wash away. He wrote about choosing where to stand and letting that choice do the work. Caleb closed the envelope and placed it beneath the ledger. He wrote his own entry after: the storm, the fall, the meeting, the tracks. He wrote Luke's name and did not add explanation. He wrote Sarah's figures and Elias's warning. He wrote that the ridge had spoken and they had listened. Shadow slept with his head on Caleb's foot, breathing slow. Outside, the ground dried where it could and held where it must. The lines were there now, drawn, tested, and kept. Spring did not arrive all at once on North Ridge. It came in increments, snow retreating from shaded hollows, water loosening the ground, birds testing the air with brief, uncertain calls. Caleb felt the change in the way mornings no longer bit at his knuckles and in the way shadow rose without stiffness, stretching once before settling into his watch. Rowan shed his winter coat in uneven patches, the chestnut hair catching on fence rails and brush, patient with the process. The land was shifting, and with it, the terms. Caleb used the clearer days to do what Henry had prepared him for, maintenance that prevented arguments later. He replaced rotted boards along the porch, regraded the runoff channels Sarah had flagged, and reset boundary stakes deeper, marking them with reflectors that caught light without calling attention. But he kept notes, measurements, dates, weather, not as evidence but as memory made durable. Luke's confidence grew quietly. He no longer waited to be told what to do each minute. He noticed loose hardware, tightened it. He learned to read the ledgers and asked careful questions about entries that referenced people he had heard of but never met. His shoulders were less drawn in, his voice steadied. When he smiled, rare, brief, it felt earned. Caleb corrected him when needed and praised him once when it mattered. Luke absorbed both. Sarah brought news that the council would reconvene within the month. She laid out options without drama, listing who might support a conservation easement, who would require convincing. Her hair was wind-tossed, her boots dusted with mud, and she spoke with the clarity of someone who had already counted the cost. She had learned long ago that hope needed a ledger. Elias returned to work slowly, shoulder healing, movements measured. He took on tasks that required judgment rather than strength, inspecting joints, checking tolerances, listening to machines as they came back to life. His beard had thinned where gray overtook dark, and the lines at his eyes deepened when he smiled. Pain had made him more patient, not less. Nothing worth keeping likes being rushed, he said, and meant more than tools. The testing continued, but it changed shape. No more trucks at night. Instead, paperwork arrived, requests for access surveys, notices phrased as cooperation. Caleb answered in writing, concise and factual. He included maps Henry had prepared, documentation from the cold room that established rights and limits. He did not accuse, he defined. One afternoon, a woman arrived unannounced. She was in her late 40s, medium height, with close-cropped black hair and a posture that suggested discipline. Her jacket bore the insignia of the county land office. Her name was Marisol Vega. She introduced herself without ceremony, eyes moving over the mill, the ridge, the work underway. "I'm here to verify conditions," she said. Her voice was level, her manner professional. She carried a clipboard but did not hide behind it. Caleb walked the perimeter with her. Shadow stayed close, not interfering, simply present. Marisol asked precise questions and took notes. She knelt to examine runoff channels, tested soil compaction with practiced hands, and looked up only when something required explanation. She did not promise outcomes. She confirmed facts. At the edge of the clearing, she paused. "This place has been maintained," she said. "Not praise, assessment. That matters." "It does," Caleb replied. When she left, she nodded once at Luke and once at Sarah, acknowledging work done without comment. The visit did not feel like a victory. It felt like a line drawn in ink rather than chalk. That evening, Caleb opened the mill doors wider and let the light in. He set up benches for repairs that had been deferred, inviting Elias to teach rather than do. Luke listened, hands steady, asking when unsure. Sarah brought a pot of stew and set it near the stove, matter-of-fact hospitality that asked nothing back. As dusk fell, Jonah Price returned. This time he parked openly and approached without pretense. His coat was less polished, his beard rougher, eyes sharper. He stood where the lantern cast equal light on both men. "You're making this difficult," Jonah said. Caleb did not argue. "I'm making it accurate," Jonah exhaled, frustration slipping through. "There's money here. You could take it and be done." "Done with what?" Caleb asked. Jonah hesitated. That was answer enough. Shadow stepped forward, not threatening, simply closing the space. Jonah glanced at the dog and then at the mill behind Caleb, at the people working inside. He nodded once, curt, and left without another word. The days that followed were quieter. Work progressed. Luke learned to plane boards true. Elias restored a machine Henry had marked as ready when needed. Sarah finalized arrangements for a conservation easement that would bind the ridge to limits enforceable beyond any single owner. Marisol's report arrived, thorough and neutral, neatly confirming conditions that favored restraint. On a clear morning, Caleb rode Rowan to the stand of pines again. He did not open the hatch. He stood, listened, and turned back. The place did not require proof. It required respect. That night, Caleb added to the ledger. He wrote about staying, not as defiance, but as practice. He listed names and tasks completed. He noted the weather and the way the ground held after rain. He closed with a sentence Henry might have approved. What endures is what is tended. Shadow slept nearby, muzzle on his paws. Rowan shifted in the shelter, calm. The ridge held its shape, no longer testing as sharply. Caleb felt it then, not as relief, but as alignment. He was no longer reacting. He was choosing. The decision arrived without ceremony, not as a vote or a letter, but as a morning when the ridge held firm after a night of heavy rain. Water ran where Sarah had predicted it would, channels carrying it away from the mill without tearing at the soil. Caleb walked the perimeter at first light, boots sinking only where they were meant to, Shadow pacing beside him with the unhurried confidence of a dog who knew the ground as well as any map. The land answered in the only language that mattered, by holding. By mid-morning, the council's notice came. Not triumph, not defeat, a confirmation. The conservation easement would proceed as drafted, binding the ridge to limits that could not be undone by a change of hands. Development would stop at the line Henry had drawn years earlier, reinforced now by signatures and seals. Caleb read the letter once and set it aside. He did not raise his voice. He did not call anyone. He went back to work. Luke arrived late that day, breathless from the climb, a folded paper in his hand. His shoulders were broader now, his movements more assured. He had cut his hair shorter, practical, and his boots had been resoled. The boy who had waited for instruction now brought questions formed from experience. "Mr. Monroe," he said, holding out the paper. "I got accepted. Trade school, carpentry program." Caleb took the paper, scanned it, and handed it back. "Good," he said. Praise delivered once, and meant. Luke's mouth twitched into a grin he didn't quite trust yet. "I'll still come by," he added quickly. "Weekends." "I know," Caleb said. Sarah came in the afternoon with seed trays and a plan for a small plot near the southern edge, where sunlight held longest. Her hair was tied back, sleeves rolled, posture relaxed in a way that came only after decision settled. "We'll start small," she said. "Soil tells you what it wants." Elias followed, slower than before, but steady, carrying a box Henry had marked years ago and never opened. He set it on the bench without comment. Inside were tools restored to working order, wrapped against time. Elias's hands lingered on a chisel, thumb tracing the edge. He kept this for when it mattered, he said. In the weeks that followed, the mill changed shape without losing itself. Machines hummed again, not constantly, but as needed. Repairs were logged. Materials were traded rather than hoarded. Neighbors came quietly, one or two at a time, not to look, but to work. A retired teacher brought photographs and stories, careful not to ask for display. A widow left a box of ledgers from her late husband's shop, trusting they would be read with care. The ridge did not become a destination. It became a practice. One evening, near the end of May, Caleb rode Rowan to the stand of pines with Shadow trotting ahead. Rowan was sleeker now, coat bright, the white blaze clean against his brow. The horse moved with the assurance of a place he recognized. Caleb dismounted, stood where the hatch lay buried beneath new growth, and did nothing. He listened to the wind pass through needles, to the small sounds that returned when the world felt safe enough to speak. He did not open the ground. He did not need to. Back at the mill, as dusk settled, Jonah Price returned for the last time. He looked smaller without his entourage, beard grown out, eyes tired. He stood at the edge of the clearing and did not cross it. "I'm done," he said, not apology, admission. "You won." Caleb shook his head. "No one lost," he said. "That matters." Jonah considered this, then nodded once. He left without asking for anything else. Summer arrived in full, green, and generous. The small plot took. Luke learned to plane boards until they sang. Sarah's numbers held. Elias taught when his shoulder allowed and watched when it didn't, correcting with a look rather than a word. Shadow aged into his days with grace, muzzle whitening, patience deepening. He slept more, but when he stood, the ridge still aligned around him. On a quiet Sunday, Caleb opened the final envelope from the cold room. Henry's handwriting was steady, the message spare. He wrote about endings that were not conclusions, about choosing work that made room for others, about knowing when to close a book and when to leave it open. The last line was simple. If you're reading this here, you've learned enough. Caleb closed the envelope and returned it to its place. He carried the ledgers upstairs and set them on the shelf where light could reach them without fading the ink. He added his final entry for the season, listing names and weather and the way the ground held after rain. He did not sign it with ceremony. He dated it and closed the book. That night, the ridge gathered its sounds, crickets beginning their work, the low murmur of wind, the creak of wood settling into warmth. Shadow lay at Caleb's feet, breathing slow. Rowan shifted in the shelter, content. Caleb sat on the porch with a mug cooling in his hands and watched the stars come out one by one as they always had. He understood then what Henry had left him. Not a refuge from the world, but a way to meet it without losing shape. Not silence, but the kind that let others speak. The ridge did not need defending anymore. It needed tending. Caleb stayed. Sometimes God does not arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes his miracles come quietly, through patience, through endurance, through hands that choose to stay when walking away would be easier. This story is not about land or inheritance or winning against the world. It is about what happens when a broken heart becomes a shelter, when a man who thought his purpose was over discovers that God was only preparing him for a different kind of mission. In our daily lives, we often overlook the things that seem small, slow, or unimportant. But Scripture reminds us that God often hides his greatest blessings inside what the world calls worthless. A quiet place, a forgotten person, a second chance. If you are watching this today and feel unseen, underestimated, or weary, know this: God has not forgotten you. He may not remove the struggle immediately, but he can transform it into purpose. And sometimes that purpose begins the moment you choose to stay faithful instead of giving up. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe in stories of healing, faith, and second chances, subscribe to this channel so more quiet miracles can reach those who need them most. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May he bring peace to your heart, strength to your journey, and light to every place you feel forgotten. Amen.